folks, and welcome to this webinar on contractors versus employees, and just learning about how to hire people for your practice. I will say that this is a little different, the recording here, and that Julie and I just ran into some tremendous technical difficulties on the platform we were using. I think it's just people were getting on the internet, and so Julie, glad you rejoined me here.
Thanks for having me, Gordon.
Yes, and so just want to say, and I mentioned this in the webinar, original live webinar, was just want to name the fact that as we're recording this on March the 17th, 2020, there's just a lot of anxiety for a lot of us around the COVID-19 pandemic that's occurring as we're going through this. And so I know a lot of people are just kind of hunkering down and staying inside and trying to avoid the social contact and just being very careful about everything. And so just wanted to let folks know that this is just a season and we'll get through this. And I know it's affecting a lot of private practice owners in that, and I've already seen it this week for me, just more cancellations and people not wanting to get out, even though we're offering video conferencing and teleconferencing for our practices. But anyway, we're going to press through, and hopefully this recording, for those of you that were on the live webinar, again, hopefully this is going to be a much better thing for you. So we're going to jump into this webinar on contractors versus employees. And so I'm going to share our screen here, and that way we can jump in here.
Yeah, and our goal for the webinar really is we want private practice owners to understand the hiring options they have, what the differences are between contractors and employees. And so, just as a disclaimer, every tax situation can be different. So this is definitely not a legal discussion. We'll touch on some legal topics, but we do still recommend that you check with a lawyer in your state. And then every tax situation can be different. So if in doubt, you should definitely contact your tax preparer, your tax advisor to discuss your specific circumstances.
Right. And the other reason that we're doing this webinar, and I hope that you'll think about this, and is that when your practice reaches a certain level, particularly for those that are solo practitioners, it really makes sense that when you're full, a lot of people want to begin adding clinicians or adding employees. And so we felt like this information was just really important for people. The other thing I want to just say on the front end here is that at the end here, we're going to be talking about the Money Matters in Private Practice course that Julie and I have put together that goes into much more in depth around this topic of finances and managing the financial side of private practice. And we're also going to be offering a discount to that. So stick around to the end to find out about that discount. Julie and I have put a lot of work into this course, and I think it's just really valuable content. But today for the webinar, we're just focusing on one particular aspect of private practice, which is when it comes to hiring people and knowing the difference between things. So we didn't do a proper introduction. I'm Gordon Brewer. I'm the person behind the Practice of Therapy podcast and also the blog there. I'm a private practice owner myself. Been in private practice about, 20 years now. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and have a group practice in Kingsport, Tennessee, which is in the northeast corner of Tennessee. And Julie, tell folks about you.
Yeah, so my name is Julie Harris. I am the owner of Green Oak Accounting. We are an accounting firm based just outside of Washington, D.C., and we provide specialized accounting services specifically for private practice owners. And we work with practices all throughout the United States, literally from east to west and north to south.
So, Julie, you want to talk about what we're going to be covering today?
Yeah, so today we're talking about what the difference is between contractors and employees, the way to hire each of them. We're talking about pros and cons of each. We're going to talk about different compensation structures that work for contractors and for employees. We'll talk about fee splitting and specifically the ethics side of fee splitting. We're going to talk about payroll and benefits and some legal and tax implications as well.
Right. So let's move on to the next slide here. So I guess the place to start is really to begin to define the difference between what is a contractor versus an employee. And particularly here in the United States, there's two different ways that that the IRS looks at people that you hire for your business or hire to do things for you. The first one is just a contractor, in that when we think about a contractor, one way to think about it in the kind of the traditional sense is somebody that you would hire to come into your home and do something for you. You're hiring them to do something very specific. Usually with contractors, you're not going to tell them how to do their job, but just kind of tell them what you want done. Also, you're not really going to set any specific hours for them in terms of telling them when. You might tell them, during normal business hours, but you're not going to tell them when to do the work, that sort of thing. Contractors are generally referred to as 1099 employees or 1099 people, and that's just referring to the form that you give them at the end of the year that reports to the IRS what you paid them. And that is something that you need to track throughout the year, and then you get them the 1099 form at the end of the year. People that you hire as contractors are considered self-employed, not employees of you. And so they need to have their own tax ID number. It's really preferable too if they have their own business entity. And so they give you that through a W-9 at the beginning of the year when you hire them as a contractor. They typically pay all of their own expenses. So you're not going to, when you hire a contractor, you're not going to be paying for any of their operating expenses. That's on them. They have to buy their own supplies, their own probably use their own electronic health record systems, all of those sorts of things. They also have to have their own liability and malpractice insurance typically. You're not going to pay them any benefits or workman's comp or any of that. It's just like if you hired somebody to replace the roof on your house, you would hire them for that specific job. They would come in and do it, but you're not going to stand them and tell them how to do it. So it's very specific in that way. Julie, anything you want to add on contractors?
So two things. First, the limit for contractors. So you need to issue a 1099 if you pay someone $600 or more in 1 year, and that's $600 in cash, check, ACH, anything that's not a credit card payment. Then you're required to issue them a 1099. So it's much easier to get that W-9 when you first hire them before the first payment. That's our standard in my practice, where we get that on the front end because that's the easiest time to get it. And Gordon, I think I remember you saying that when you had contractors in your business, you typically required them to show proof of their insurance before bringing them on, correct? Okay.
Correct. Yeah. I would require a copy of their liability and malpractice insurance just to cover myself.
Yeah,
and
just
obviously,
to make sure.
Yeah, and the other thing too is you want to have a contract with them. So you need to have something in writing, and you would do that with employees as well. But you want to have something that's going to really spell out what they're providing for you as a contractor.
Yep.
So, okay, so employees, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, when you have employees, so you as the employer can set their hours. So you are also able to dictate how and when the work is done, right? So what hours they're required to be there, how many clients they're supposed to see per week. There's a lot more, you have a lot more say when you have employees versus contractors. And so that's why in most states, provisionally licensed therapists, they're required to be employees. It's not a choice that you have in most states. They have to be your employee because you supervise their work. You're required to supervise it. So in a setting where you have a lot of supervision, or you're using a specific modality and you want to be able to train them in a specific way, employees make a lot of sense. So when you have employees, you're going to be required to withhold federal and state withholdings, and then remit that to the appropriate authorities, right? And so that's one of the big pieces that makes it a little bit more cumbersome, is that you're required to withhold that, but there's a very specific timeline for you to remit that to the state and to the IRS. So you have to be on top of those things. The other thing is there are additional expenses to having employees. As the employer, you are required to pay 1/2 of the FICA, and that's also called the employer taxes. So FICA is Social Security and Medicare. You're also required to pay unemployment, so both at the state level and at the federal unemployment, and the state unemployment tax, and then federal unemployment tax. A lot of times when you have employees, they're covered under your insurance, so there's an additional insurance cost on you, the practice owner. If you're offering any benefits, there is an additional cost to that. But then usually there's also a cost to a payroll processing fee. So whether you have a Gusto subscription or a QuickBooks Online, like there's a fee to run that payroll, but it's well worth it when they're also filing all of the quarterly reports, all of the year-end reports, all the W-2s. Like it's well worth that to be compliant.
Right. And like we said at the beginning, be sure you check with somebody that knows and is familiar with your state laws, employment laws, and what are required, because there are some states that require that you provide a certain amount of sick time or a certain amount of unemployment insurance and different benefits and that sort of thing. So it's important to be in touch with somebody.
And one of the things we were talking about, Gordon, is that you're really never going to get in trouble for having an employee. You sometimes can get in trouble for having a contractor, but there's something also that happens in your practice when you have a lot of say over what people can do. Is I found in my practice that most businesses that have employees are simply more profitable. And I attribute that to two things. One is that you can set their hours. You can require them to work specific hours, but you're also able to say you need to see at least X clients per week.
Right. And as we had said before, I think one of the myths is that just because a contractor is simpler and it does have less costs associated with it, it doesn't mean that that's the most profitable thing to do. I can tell you from my own practice, when I switched from contractors to employees, I became much more profitable. And I think a big part of that is that the employees are much more invested in the company, much more invested in the practice. And we're going to talk some more about the pros and cons of contractors,
yes,
and employees. So there's some things, kind of some tests or some bullet points we need to remember when thinking about what is the difference between how the IRS looks at a 1099 employee versus an employee.
So there's two different tests. So if we can go back one slide.
Okay.
So the IRS has the common law test. So this is used by the IRS and by 17 states, plus the District of Columbia. So they're looking at the behavioral control, financial control, and the relationship. And what they mean by that is that when they're looking at behavioral control, they're looking at what we were talking about before, the type of instruction that's given. Do you have any say on where or when someone is working in the business, the degree of instruction that you're providing for that work? And then they also look at the systems that you have in place. Like, do you have metrics in place to measure how they're doing? Are you evaluating the work that they're doing on a regular basis, and how much are you training them? So that's all part of the behavioral control. On the financial control side, they look at how much financial control does the business owner have on the employee or contractor, right? So is there an opportunity for profit and for loss? In a contractor situation, you'd probably need that, where if they're running their own business, they may make a profit, they may not. It's not dependent on you. Whereas as far as financial control, if someone is expecting a regular steady paycheck, like they have a guaranteed number of hours, for example, that tends to indicate more of an employee-employer relationship. And then when they look at the relationship side of things, they're looking at the permanency of the relationship. So is it just for a small amount of time? Like if a contractor is coming in to redo your bathroom, that's a short, very defined project, or is it just expected to go on indefinitely? That's something that they would look at. But they also look at, is this service a core service of the business? And if so, that might indicate a relationship of an employee versus an employer. So of the consequences, if the IRS looks at your contractor situation and determines that they should have been employees, like what could happen, the possible consequence is that you would owe payroll tax on those amounts. So you would owe the payroll tax, the penalties, and the interest. You would have to go back and get compliant. So it could be very, very expensive. One thing that I've always also seen happen is that, if you hire someone as a contractor, even though you may have a contractor agreement, they may decide at a later time, you know what, I'm going to contact the IRS, and they can do that with a form called an SS8, and have the IRS determine whether this is a contractor relationship or an employee relationship. And so that can put you in a little bit of a pickle if you have a situation with an employee that a situation that went wrong, where they can come back and then put you in that situation.
Right. The other thing that you can run into is if a person that you've hired as a contractor is not paying their self-employment tax, that's a flag for the IRS. So you want to just make sure that when you hire somebody as a contractor, they understand that they are self-employed and not an employee of you,
Yeah.
and that they're taking care of their own taxes. I've known of a few situations where the person that had hired the contractor got, for example, as we like to call it, you and I like to call it, a love letter from the IRS, wanting to know why they are haven't paid any FICA for this particular person because that person had not paid any of their self-employment tax throughout the year, the quarterly taxes.
That's true. And if, as you're making that hire, I think, as the practice owner, you might be very clear on what the differences are between an employee and a contractor, but it's a good idea to remind the contractor of what the implications are for them, that you're not withholding any tax and that they should be saving for quarterly estimated taxes, because they should be paying that on a regular basis. So the second test, this is an ABC test. So this is a test that's used by 33 states. So it's a completely separate test. And so sometimes you can fall, under the common law test for the IRS, but then the ABC test for the state, and then you can get conflicting results here. So this, for the states using the ABC test, we're looking at, for A, absence of control. So the worker is free from control and direction of the hiring entity. So for example, if you, Gordon, hire my firm to do your accounting, you're not telling us how to do accounting. We already know how to do that, right? So that's very much a contractor relationship. So the B is the business of the worker. So the worker is performing work that's outside the scope of the employer's main business. Again, therapy versus accounting, or therapy versus marketing. That's a really clear, it's not the main scope of the business. And so this is where, a lot of states like California, for example, are getting very, very specific and saying, if someone is employed in the main scope of your work, we don't want that to be a contractor. And then C, customarily engaged. So you must be, so basically the worker must be customarily engaged in the same kind of work for someone else, basically. So, you could have a contractor where they also see their own patients on the side, for example, or who's also working for someone else part-time, right? Like that could be a legitimate contractor, but generally if you're just doing it for one person, that tends to look like it's not a contractor.
Right. One thing I'll add here, Julie, and I've just heard this from other practitioners that are in states that apply this ABC test, is they might have like employees that do just kind of the general kind of work for their practice, but they might hire somebody as a contractor, like, for example, somebody that does psychological testing. That's not normally what they do as part of their practice, and they treat them as a contractor, or like a nurse practitioner that might be prescribing medicines, those kinds of things. Those are those are much more clear delineations, and you can do those kinds of things.
Yeah, especially in a case where the nurse practitioner, for example, is maybe working at the practice 1 or 2 days a week and then also somewhere else.
Correct, correct. So here's, and we'll chime in together on this, just some kind of the pros and cons of having contractors versus employees. On the pro side for contractors, obviously they're less expensive in terms of less overhead costs for the practitioner. You don't have to pay the FICA or unemployment insurance and those kinds of things. On the surface, it seems like less of a risk because a contractor's doing their own thing. So if any liability issues come up, you're not necessarily liable. The contractor would be liable. It's obviously simpler to pay in terms of you just give them what they're due, whether it be a percentage or a flat fee per session or whatever. And we're going to talk some more about that here in a minute. There's simple compliance with this. There's not a lot of forms you have to worry about, just doing the 1099 at the end of the year. You don't have to supervise them as much. You just let them do their job and do their thing. You don't have to worry about it, like I said, unemployment or FICA or that sort of thing. The downside is obviously you can't supervise them as much.
It's a pro and a con, right? Like there's a pro, you don't have to supervise that much, but the con is you really shouldn't supervise them very much.
Correct. And then you can't set their hours or tell them how to do their work. So if you have a specific modality of therapy that you want people to do, you're probably better off having an employee rather than a contractor. Contractor could do, for example, if I hired a contractor to come in and see clients and they do like hypnotherapy, even though I don't do hypnotherapy, I can't tell them to stop doing hypnotherapy or anything like that. I don't have control over how they do their work. And as we mentioned, some states just do not allow contractors. And the big one that comes to mind is California. The way their laws are set up, you can't really have a contractor in your practice.
Yeah, and that's a fairly new turn of events.
You're right. And then the final con for contractors is you're typically going to pay them a higher percentage just because your overhead is less. So they keep a larger part of a fee split or a flat rate or whatever. And we're going to talk some more about fee splits in a minute. So Julie, you want to talk about employees?
Yeah, so the definite pro of having employees is that you have complete control over the schedule and hours. And if you have employees and you're not requiring a specific schedule from them, you really should. You have control over the process and how work is done, so you can require them to use a specific EHR. You can require them to do their notes within 24 hours. Like you can require whatever you want as far as a process. You're not going to run into any compliance issues because there are no compliance issues for employees. You could run into some payroll issues, but not non-compliance. Employees really just tend to be more committed to your business because you're also more committed to them. You have the ability to offer PTO and other benefits to retain employees. Typically, you're also going to pay a lower percentage of the session fee. And part of that is because you have the additional expense and you as the employer are paying a part of the FICA. So instead of the employee paying that on their own, you're paying them a little bit less, but you're accounting for that FICA, the Social Security and Medicare. But there's also a lot fewer restrictions on the work that you can ask them to do. And there's also a lot less compliance on the employee's side, right? So they don't have to be saving for taxes, trying to estimate what their liability is going to be. They don't have to do a Schedule C at the end of the year. As an employee, they just get a W-2 and they prep their taxes, and it's a really simple thing. On the con side, though, you're required to pay FICA, right? So you need to have a payroll system for that payroll compliance. You're also required to pay state unemployment and federal unemployment, but then you can also have claims against you. So that is something that can come back and cost you additional funds. You may be required to have workers' compensation depending on your state. The requirements do vary. And in some states and cities, you may be required to offer sick leave as well. So it's something that you want to take into account. Also, as you're putting together that initial compensation package, if you have that full picture of what exactly it's going to cost you, you can take all of those things into account. But then you also may need to cover them in your insurance. So again, another expense to consider
Right.
when you're setting up compensation.
Right. And so one thing about this, I will say, is it's important to know your numbers. And you hear that theme from me a lot and from Julie of just really understanding what are your costs of operating and that sort of thing. As I mentioned earlier, when I switched from having strictly contractors to employees, I actually became much more profitable as a practice because I made that shift, because I took into account the expenses here and all of that sort of thing. But I'm ended up keeping you end up keeping more for yourself, and also you end up increasing your your call volume, if you will, or the number of people getting in touch, because again, the employees are bringing they want to do well for the company.
Mhm. So there's a couple of different compensation structures that are that are most common. The first one, percentage of fee collected or commission, to me, that's still probably the most popular. That's the one I see most often, where, for example, if you're getting a reimbursement of $100, there may be a fee split of 50% to the clinician, and that's what they're getting. The reverse commission is kind of the opposite of that. I see that mostly, that one is rare. I see that in states where it is more difficult to have contractors, where really the contractor is operating as their own legal entity. So they're intaking their own patients. Usually they're doing the billing for their own patients as well. So they're basically using the practice for overhead services and incoming leads. But at the end of the month, they're looking at how much they made and giving a percentage of their fee to the practice. So the practice is not getting all the income and then paying the clinician. It's the opposite that's happening. Second most popular is flat fee per session, where you really look at the averages in your practice and what your average reimbursement is, and select one fee per session or per clinical hour. So for every clinical hour that your clinician is working, they're getting a specific dollar amount, which is nice because they know what to expect, but then it's also really easy for you to forecast as well. The only thing is if you mess up your hourly average, your hourly reimbursement average, you can really set up the wrong flat fee. Have you seen that happen, Gordon?
Yes, and again, like I said earlier, you really need to know your numbers in setting this up. I happen to use a flat fee in my practice in terms of I pay my clinicians on a graduated scale. Again, it's kind of a commission structure and a flat fee combined, but I had to know what my numbers were on the front end in terms of, I'm an insurance-based practice, so I had to know what my average per session rate was. I needed to know what my overhead costs were and all of those things, and to really crunch the numbers on that. But it's turned out to be much more profitable for the practice by doing it that way. And plus the employees, they know what to expect. They know what they're getting per session, just without having to figure percentages and all that sort of thing. It's a simple way of doing it. So
yeah. And then another one we see still often is an hourly rate, and that happens most often in states where you're required to have a base minimum hourly wage, where you can't just pay an hourly rate per session. You do have to track specific hours. And once in a while, we'll see a salaried clinician. That typically will happen more when they're very full-time. They have a very predictable schedule. But also when there's a leadership position. So in larger practices, typically we see a leadership level somewhere around the $1.5 million range. That's what I typically see, where part of their duties will be leadership, and then they're still seeing some clients as well. But then most often they're going to be on a salary. And then one of the considerations in setting up compensation is the timing. So whether you're going to pay when the service is rendered or when the payment is received, because that makes a very big difference on your cash flow.
And typically what I see is people maybe start out just paying when the payment is received, and then move into paying when the service is rendered once they have a buffer set. And again, that's something we'll talk a little bit
Mhm.
about here. So one of the things that always comes up is this term fee splitting. And people get a little bit, if you, for lack of a better way, put a little bit squirrely about that, because in a lot of our ethical codes, fee splitting is not something that is considered ethical. But I think you have to look at the context of this and what they mean by fee splitting. In our ethical codes, what they're talking about is you cannot pay somebody a commission for sending you a referral. In other words, you can't split your fee with somebody, say like a doctor that sends you a referral and you give him a kickback or her a kickback for sending you a client. That's what they're discouraging. It's just like with most physicians with pharmaceuticals. Most pharmaceutical companies pay um, doctors a kickback or a commission or whatever for prescribing certain drugs. And that's considered ethical in that world. But in our world, we can't pay somebody outside our practice a commission for referring somebody to us. It's considered unethical. But fee splitting in this sense that we're talking about here in terms of paying people is that the practice is keeping a portion of what is collected in order to cover overhead and to pay for all the things that are needed. And if you think about it, every single agency, practice, or whatever that is providing services does fee splitting. In other words, when patients or clients pay us, we have to keep a portion of that in order to stay in business. So in that sense, all of it is fee splitting. So I just wanted to clarify that, just that whole concept. And so we can't take we can't give a kickback or split a fee with somebody for just giving us a referral. But if we hire somebody to provide those services, we split the fee with them either through paying them a salary, or paying them an hourly rate, through a
Mhm.
flat rate, or a percentage. It's all fee splitting. So
And
again,
really,
yeah,
as a group practice owner, you must split the fee, right? It's you go into business to make money, but you're also, as the practice owner, you're working probably a lot more than everyone else. You are supervising a large team. Maybe you have an administrative team or a biller. You're working on the marketing. Like, there's a lot of services that you do, and that's one of the reasons that you get to keep some of the money. And you can and should build in profit into any fee split.
correct. The other thing too is with fee splitting, one of the things that is again a common practice is sort of a commission structure or having a performance incentive. So, for example, in my practice, I pay a flat rate per clinical hour. And once a clinician gets past a certain volume for the month, then their their flat rate goes up as well. So it's a graduated system. Again, you've got to know your numbers well in order to make it profitable for yourself. So what that does is gives them an incentive to see more clients because they get paid more, not only on the volume, but also at the base rate at which they see clients. So in my practice, it's worked out well, but again, it's because I know my numbers, I know what to expect, and I know what my overhead costs for it to work out.
Yeah. When so let's say you've decided to hire an employee, or that you want employees. So we wanted to just touch base quickly about setting up payroll. So there's a couple of things that you're going to need for that. One is your federal EIN. You should already have this, so definitely don't get a new one just for payroll. But that's the number that you're going to use. That's going to be on all of your payroll forms. That's what you're going to use to remit federal withholdings, Social Security, Medicare, and federal unemployment. So you want to have that handy when you're setting up payroll. You also want to go to your state website. You should Google withholding account plus, with your state basically, and it will show you how to sign up for that. But each state has a slightly different process. But you need to sign up for a withholding account with the state. They're going to give you a specific number there. Sometimes it will include part of your federal EIN, sometimes it won't. And sometimes you'll also be able to sign up for unemployment at the same website. Sometimes it will be a different website. Some states also have a third item like a disability or something else along those lines that you also have to sign up for and remit. So just make sure, look at what specifically is needed in your state. And we do, Gordon and I both recommend Gusto. If you go to their website, to the support section of their website, they have a great state compliance list. So go to their compliance list and look up your specific state, and they'll show you all the things that you need. So if you have all those ducks lined up before you sign up for payroll, I know you can go to practiceoftherapy.com/Gusto to set up an account. You can also set that up through QuickBooks Online, but I would definitely recommend always going with either your accounting firm or a payroll service and not trying to DIY, because failing to remit on time can be extremely costly, and it's not worth the headache to just save a couple of dollars.
Right. And I'll tell you from experience, I did the DIY first, just through my QuickBooks desktop. And I wish I had started with Gusto or another payroll service. It's well worth the return on investment to do it. They just make it seamless and that sort of thing. And just quick disclaimer, that link there, practiceoftherapy.com/Gusto, is an affiliate link. So I just want to be transparent about that. So.
And just keep in mind when you're setting up payroll, again, some compliance items, like take a look at, does your state have a mandatory sick leave? Are you required to either accrue every number of hours, 1 hour per every X amount of hours that they work? Do you have mandatory workers' comp? So like look at those things. And this is also where, a consultation with an employment attorney in your state can be very helpful, as far as like they'll know exactly what you need to do. You can also do a lot of Googling, but that's usually, an employment attorney can usually help you with all of those things pretty easily.
Right. So the other thing about being an employer is that you can, and having employees, is that you can provide health insurance and benefits and profit sharing and all of those kinds of things, paid time off, all those sort of things. Again, being able to know what the requirements are. For health insurance, Julie, you want to talk about this? Employers with 50 or more full-time employees?
Yeah, so there's still a federal mandate. So if you are an employer with 50 or more full-time equivalents, you are required to provide health insurance. But what that means is that most private practices are not required to cover it, right? So most of the time when a client comes to us and says, I'd really like to add health insurance, it's because they want to add that as a benefit for retention, because their clinicians need it, or sometimes like they don't want to lose a clinician that's very valuable to the practice, and so they want to offer a more competitive package. So it's usually not because you have to, but because you want to. And then the best way to do that is to either go contact an insurance broker in your state that can look at different companies. But if you're with a company like Gusto, they do have benefits packages as well. So that would certainly be an option where you can shop that with Gusto and see different options there that are usually pretty competitive. And then the nice thing is that's all integrated as far as all the deductions as well.
And we did that this year, and it was so simple.
So easy, right?
Yeah, right. It really was.
And there's other, do you want to talk about other benefits that you can offer? Yeah.
So another thing, and again, this was something I did, is I'm offering a profit sharing, or it's just called a simple IRA, and that the practice matches up to a certain percentage of what an employee makes for the year if they choose to participate in that. And so that's again, another perk. It's a profit sharing plan to where they get essentially free money if they decide to contribute to their retirement plan. It's a simple IRA. And again, I set that up with somebody local, but it's all with Gusto. It goes ahead and deducts that and tracks that for me. And it's simple. They also have their plans that they can offer through their service as well.
Yeah, so I started a 401k for my employees with Gusto this year, and it's been a really good experience for everyone too. But paid time off is another great benefit to offer employees. Continuing education reimbursement, QSERA is a qualified small employer health reimbursement arrangement. That's quite a mouthful, but that's a great plan to offer if you maybe don't want to pay 50% of the employee's health insurance, but you just want to offer them something. You could, for example, set up $200 a month as an allowance, and then the employee can just get reimbursed for whatever medical expenses or health insurance that they need.
Right. So some of the legal tax implications, again, as we mentioned earlier, do touch base with somebody, an accountant or an attorney that is familiar with your state and your local requirements, because it varies so much across the country. And so you just really want to make sure that you're prepared for that. Employees are more expensive than contractors, but again, if you run your numbers, it can actually be more profitable in the long run, even though your expenses are higher. But make sure that you check all of that out. Anything you want to add there on that,
Yeah,
Julie?
so I would also say, like, just know your risk tolerance. So obviously, if we're not saying contractors are better or employees are better, but just know what risks you're okay with taking, and then understand the consequences of what those risks might be. And hopefully we've covered a lot of that today. And just know that because a person is considered a contractor with the IRS does not necessarily mean that they're also considered a contractor at the state level. So we've seen as recently as a few months ago, situations where, for the federal level, someone was classified as a contractor, but then on the state, the state did require them to pay unemployment premiums on that contractor. So just know that can happen. So if you get one of those love letters from the state, then just contact your accountant, and that's something that they can help you deal with them.
Right. So one of the things, and I'm going to let Julie jump in here, when converting from contractors to employees, which was again something I did a few years ago, there's some things you need to consider.
Yeah, so first, when you're converting someone from a contractor to an employee, their rate should not stay the same, period. Because as an employee, you're going to have to pay another 7.65 in FICA, and then another percentage point on federal unemployment and state unemployment. So that number shouldn't stay the same unless you're really planning for them to get a really significant raise. It does end up being somewhere between 8.5 and 10%. Depending on the state, right? So generally speaking, you're going to see a reduction in the rate because the employer is paying half of that FICA. So what I was trying to show here is in the first column, you see the contractor, they might be getting a 50% split, but then they're paying 15.3% in self-employment tax. So that's coming off the top of what they're keeping, right? So they may be taking more home, but they're keeping less. So if you set them up as an employee getting a 45% split, for example, then you would pay, about that 10% in FICA, and it would just about end up being the same or very close. But if you kept them at the same 50% split, then you're adding on top of that, payroll tax, which is 10% of the base. So you would end up paying them closer to 55%. So I just want to make sure that you see that difference and really run the numbers on what that looks like. We do a lot of work with compensation in my firm, and so that's one thing we look at, like, what is the difference and what makes sense here. But then I also would advise you, like, leave room for raises where you're not starting someone at your very max capacity, because then when they want more, there won't be any room for that. And I always think it's a good idea to do some market research as well on what people are paying in your area. So, like, if your clinician went to work somewhere else, what could they make? What could they make as an agent at an agency working full time? Whereas in your practice, they might be working, closer to 30 hours versus 50. So you're taking all those pieces into consideration and making sure that they're getting a fair and definitely livable wage, but that there's enough room for everything else in the business too.
Right. And I know, again, if those of you that are maybe have contractors already and you're thinking of switching to employees, one of the things that I did just with the people that I had currently, I lost some people, I'll be honest about that, because they didn't want, because I had to reduce the split. And they were being, they had a good chunk of the split they got to keep. But what I did is just did a comparison sheet of what their take home was versus contractor versus employee, with them having to pay self-employment tax versus to what the benefits that they were getting. A contractor, they're going to be responsible for their own health insurance, for their own FICA, all of that kind of stuff is stuff that's an expense, and it takes away from their bottom line versus being employed where the employers.
Yeah, and those conversions, it's not usually an easy thing, right? When you're converting someone to a contract from a contractor to an employee, you will have some clinicians who are really happy about that change, but you will have some who, no matter how much you explain the math behind it, are not going to understand the reduction,
Right.
In the split, and so that is difficult. But just across the line, we always see an increase in profitability after that.
Right. So we've covered a lot here, haven't we, Julie?
We have.
So hopefully you'll know at this point some of the differences between what a contractor is versus an employee, some of the pros and cons, understand a little bit more about compensation and the fact that if you have employees, you're going to keep a larger percentage as an employer versus contractors. You're going to give a larger percentage to the contractors. Hopefully we cleared up some of the myths around fee splitting and maybe some of the worries and angst that people have about that particular term. Some ways of setting up payroll, and then just keeping in mind the legal and tax implications. And the thing about this is that there's so much more around the financial side of private practice that needs to be covered that we cannot do in a single webinar.
Yes.
So one of the things that we want to do is that we want to give you as many resources as we can around that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Julie and I have put together a course called Money Matters in Private Practice that goes into detail of all the different areas of the financial side of private practice besides just hiring people and having employees. And so it's a full course that just goes through the whole financial side of private practice. So with the course, and Julie, you chime in here, there's several things that you're going to get in the course that you didn't get here.
Yeah, so we talk about some basic accounting. We talk about various business entities. We talk about reports like the profit and loss and the balance sheet and understanding what those means, all the different taxes that you pay. We've talked about several of those today, but we go in much deeper. We talk about setting up QuickBooks account, the different tax deductions that are available to you. We talk about setting fees. I've told Gordon before, my favorite part of the course is his money mindset section. We talk about success ratios, and that's something that I've developed after years of working with private practice owners is what are the ratios, the percentages, like how much of a percentage should be your overhead, how much of a percentage of your income should be spent on clinicians. And we have different ratios for solo practices and for group practices. We go into detail. I show you in the training how to set up payroll with Gusto or with QuickBooks Online Payroll. And there's just a lot more in there.
Yeah. And the course itself it's probably close to 6 hours, 7 hours of instruction, but we've got it broken down into modules and broken up into smaller pieces so that you can take your time going through this. And one of the things about the course is that when you sign up for the course, you've got essentially lifetime access to the course. You can go back and use it as a reference. But again, we've set it up in a course style, just like if you were to go take a course in college or a graduate school. Again, this is a course that's not offered in many graduate schools, so that was the idea behind it. You're going to get the same type of hours and instruction. It's video instruction combined with some a copy there. Each video, it depends on the topic that's covered. We cover several different things. But again, you can pause the videos, you can come back to it, rewatch them, all of that sort of thing as you go through the course. And it's set up on the platform we use is a platform called Teachable. And so it's very easy to use and very easy to access. One of the things that comes up for people, and again, I'm going to let Julie chime in here, is who is this course really designed for?
Yeah, so when designing this course, we had a couple people in mind. So people thinking about starting a private practice, people who are starting a private practice in the beginning stages, but also people who are really ready to scale their practice and just need a much deeper understanding of the financials in their business. So these are people who are maybe not quite ready to outsource their accounting yet, but even if at some point you will outsource your accounting, it really gives you a good, deep understanding of what's going on so that you speak that financial language as well, and that when you are not doing it, you still understand what's going on in your business.
Right. And it's really designed for people regardless of the level that you're at or the place that you are in your practice. We want you to better understand the financial side of private practice. And so we feel like we've got something pretty comprehensive here in the course. One of the things that comes up for people is that when they start thinking about financial side of private practice, their eyes kind of glaze over and they think that they can't get their head around it. But believe me, if I got my head around it and I was able to learn this stuff, you can too. And again, it's something that's not taught in graduate school, not something that we all really learn about as far as the business side of private practice. So this course is, again, divided into small chunks that are easy to understand. We try to put it in simple language so that you don't have to necessarily have a master's in finance to understand all of this stuff. It's very simply put, and we want to give you the tools to help you be successful with this.
Yeah. And really, when we look at the class, the course, if you go to the next slide, like we packed in a ton of stuff. So if you were coming to my firm and saying, I really want to just spend some time with someone and learn the basics of accounting, that would cost you. The basic Money Matters in Private Practice course is $297. If you were doing Accounting 101 with someone from my team, that would probably run you $500. If we were setting up your QuickBooks account, that would run you $500 as well. If we were setting up your Gusto, that's $500 again. So because all of these things are really time consuming on my side. And then just our success ratio calculator, that's a super high value item that we normally only offer to our clients, but you have that as well. So really the total value is $1,700. Obviously we didn't want to charge that much, so we wanted to make it affordable and valuable. And so there's two different packages that we are offering today. So one is the course with the 1 hour consultation. I think this is a really great value because for $525, you get the full course with the bonus content, but you also get a 1 hour one-on-one with one of us. So you can decide who you want to be with. In cases when people have used it with me is they've gone through many portions of the course and they have very specific questions. So they come super prepared to the meeting and we get so much done in that meeting and have a recording that they have access to. So it's a really valuable way. Otherwise, I don't offer 1 hour consultations just as a standalone service. So it's a great way to get access to a highly specialized team. Right. If you feel like you don't need that, we have another option as well.
So it's the base, the Money Matters with the premium content. And again, this is, we set it up to be affordable and easy for people to access. If you just want to do the course without the consultation included in the consult price. And again, it's just $315 for the full course, or you can do 4 payments of $80 a month. So in order to get it at this price, we've got for this webinar the coupon code Irish 2020, since it's St. Patrick's Day. And you can get access to the course at practiceoftherapy.com/money matters. And this is going to be good until March the 21st. And so just got just a short time available to take care to get it at this discount. And again, it's right around a 30% discount, so it's a great deal. So,
and Gordon, we do have some Q&A, so let's get started on that. So one of our questions was, what happens when an employee is not participating with an insurance I provide for?
Yes. So one of the ways around that is if you have one option is to take advantage of the client or the patient's out-of-network benefits and treat them as an out-of-network provider. You can the client can pay for that on the front end, and they can pay for the session on the front end, and then you could give them something like what is called a super bill that they can use to turn into their insurance company, and they get reimbursed for the session. So it's quite a common thing. I do it in my practice. I've got some therapists that are on insurance panels and some that are not. And so those that are not, we also offer a sliding scale fee. One quick hack on sliding scales, though, is make sure that your lowest rate on your sliding scale fee is close to or equivalent to your average reimbursement rate for insurance. So that way you're not shooting yourself in the foot with having a sliding scale fee.
That's a really good tip.
Yeah. So other questions that we had.
Yeah, so another question we had was, what do you mean by $600 cutoff? Can you elaborate? And where would you get the W-9 form? Okay, those are good questions. So you would get the W-9 from the IRS website. That's the most up-to-date version. But basically, if you have a contractor starting in your practice, you can print that out and just have them fill it out on their first day. The W-9 gives you all the information you need to issue a 1099. So it has their full name, their address, where you're going to mail the 1099, and their social security number or EIN. So it's something you're completely allowed to require that before you give them their first payment. In my firm, that's what we usually do. We won't issue a payment unless we have that on file, because then at the end of the year, you're not stuck trying to get that information from the contractor.
Right.
So if you pay them $600 in 1 year, and that goes really quickly, in either cash, check, ACH, sometimes PayPal as well, anything that's not a credit card, you would owe them a 1099 at the end of the year. So just get that information up front.
Right. What were some of the other questions, maybe, Julie? I know we're running out of time here, but
yeah, so it said, where can I find a contract agreement for a contract employee?
Yeah, so one of the things I would say is just to Google that. But again, like we said before, you want to get whatever contract you come up with, you want to get that vetted by somebody that is local to you, that understands your local employment laws, and an attorney that is working locally that understands all of that. And again, there are lots of templates and that sort of thing out there. So, but again, just whatever contract that you come up with, I would say get it vetted. Just don't pull something off the internet and use that without get it checked out. So
yeah. So our last question for today was, would you recommend having a certain amount saved before hiring an employee? And Gordon, I know you and I were both big Profit First fans.
Yes.
And so, when we implement Profit First, typically there's going to be an owner's pay account, but I usually will set up also a payroll account separate from OpEx. So I would like to have at least enough to pay that first payroll for your employee before they start. It's also a great way to make sure that you can afford it. But if you're using Profit First, you should have a buffer in your practice anyway. I know earlier we were talking about somewhere between 3 to 6 months of expenses would be ideal. So if you, for example, all insurance reimbursements stop, you're still covered. If it was closer to 2, that would still be okay, but I would recommend some kind of buffer there.
Right. And
Of
that's
cash.
just regardless of regardless of whether you've got employees or
True.
not, you need to have a financial buffer. It just makes good business sense, and it's really a safety net for you and your practice. But yeah, just to reiterate what Julie said, I think 3 to 6 months is reasonable. Of all your expenses covered, all of your payment of employees, all of that needs to be there for worst case scenario, kind of what we're experiencing now when things slow down,
Yeah.
that we're experiencing with this, with the COVID-19 virus. Things are slowing down for people. And so we need to have that financial buffer so that we can still pay people and pay our bills and keep our offices open. So
Keep the lights on. Yes,
right.
absolutely.
Well, I know we're out of time, Julie. And again, folks, thanks for joining us for the webinar. Be sure to check out the full course at practiceoftherapy.com/money matters. Use the coupon code Irish2020 and you can get the discount for that. And so, again, there'll be more coming from Julie and I in terms of webinars. So thank you for joining us for this.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Gordon.
Bye-bye.